Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Chosen People Ministries Tuesday night Bible study. Last week we looked at the Son who was given these great titles. The government will be on his shoulders. He'll be Prince of Peace, etc., etc. The week before, if you can remember as far back as that, we looked at Isaiah 61. And when we were in Isaiah 61, I found myself traversing from 61 to 35. And I think a couple of people said they loved that passage. I think it was Tim Bath and his wife who particularly like Isaiah 35. And so I said that's what I would do next. And indeed, that's what we're going to do. And I came at Isaiah 35, not directly, but indirectly, because of the book of Philippians. It's very easy to subconsciously believe that that sort of the gospel, when you read the New Testament, they're in some chronological order. Because you sort of end in Revelation, which you know is the end, and because Matthew begins with the beginning, you tend to think that they're organized in some sort of chronological order. But actually the Gospels are probably the last part. The first and oldest writings being 1 and 2 Thessalonians. And so it is interesting to me that I was looking at the book of Philippians, and the book of Philippians strikes me because it has this wonderful promise, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it to completion until the day of Messiah Jesus. So I have used Philippians in a sort of discipleship course, and it's this text, he who began a good work in you will carry it through to completion. It's very important because it reminds, if he's promising to perfect you, you can be perfectly sure of perfection. There isn't any way that you can be sure of it in your own works. And so Philippians teaches that. But it has a unique phrase that Paul uses. He says, this good work, he says, will carry on unto completion on the day of Christ Jesus, the day of the Lord. And later he says the same, he comes up with the same idea. He's instructing us he delights in his chains, and he delights in his affection for his people. And then he says, my prayer is that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, that you may be able to discern what is best and pure and blameless until the day of Messiah. And then lastly, he prays that in chapter 2, verse 14, that we should do everything without complaining or arguing, so that we may become blameless and pure children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe, as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast of you on the day of Messiah, that I did not run or labor for nothing. He is glad and wants to rejoice with us that on this great day, everything will be put right. And this great day is the focus. That's what he's trying to teach the Philippians. If you keep, remember, I think if I talked about, if you came down to London and you went to Regent's Park and you stood in front of the notice board and it had all the different things that are in Regent's Park, London Zoo, whatever, and you'd be like, oh, the first thing you look for is the "you are here" thing. And in a sense, this is the next. This isn't you are here. This is where you will be. This is not where you are, but this is where you will be, and it's the where you will be that changes everything about where you are. It's the where you will be that changes everything about the way you are, the way you live. So how do we manage to do everything without complaining or arguing? Well, I suppose, how do we do that? Well, we probably don't do that all the time. Maybe Tuesday nights is an exceptional time where we do a good job of it. But perhaps other times during the day or at work, or when we're tired, or whatever other excuse we want to generate, we'll find ourselves complaining or arguing. And it is striking that Jesus neither complained nor argued. He submitted to the will of God and did everything without complaining. Even in some ways, even the incarnation is something you think, oh, that's a bit of a downgrade. You might want to complain about, but he didn't, because he loved us. So that I started really thinking about this day and this great future hope. And then I thought, if I'm a disciple and I'm wondering, I want to know what texts Jesus might use to outline his discipleship. Well, strangely, Isaiah 35 wasn't one that I thought of. And then I remembered that in Matthew 11, if you'll remember, John the Baptist is in prison. He's heard the deeds of the Messiah and sent his disciples to ask this question: are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? Jesus replies, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on my account. So you would be forgiven for not noticing that is from Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, because there's no announcement. There's no direct announcement that it's a quote from Scripture. It's just you have seen in 61 how it works, and you will now see in 35 how it works. So if we turn to Isaiah 35, I just want to pray for just a moment, just if that's okay. Father, would you help as we look at this text to open our blind eyes, let our ears hear your wonderful promises, and may we leap like a deer. So, the book of Isaiah. You remember, I think I've said it's in three sections. The first is a section about kingship, and the middle section is a section about the servant, and the last section is about this conquering hero that comes and puts all things right. Particularly, you see that in Isaiah, the end of Isaiah 55 onwards. You get this very detailed picture of the new creation. But I listened back to one of my talks recently, and which is a difficult thing to do, but I thought I'd better do it. And I heard myself saying that Isaiah couldn't keep a secret. Isaiah is not good. He's not good at keeping secrets. God's plan. He knows God's plan, and he's going to tell us about it. And the section that we've got, I want to just first tell you that in Isaiah chapter 32, verse 1, it says, see, a king will reign in righteousness, and rulers will rule with justice. Each man will be like a shelter from the wind and a refuge from the storm, like streams of water in the desert and the shadow of a great rock in a thirsty land. Now, you'll see why I read that last bit when we get to Isaiah 35. But for now, what I want you to see is that Isaiah, he often, he builds a story. So the first thing we've seen in chapter 32 is a king who will reign in righteousness. And then if you looked to verse 15 of chapter 32, you would see desolation until the Spirit is poured upon us from on high, and the desert becomes a fertile field, and the fertile field seems like a forest. So now we're learning that the king will reign, but it is the Spirit that will be poured out that transforms a desert into fertile land. And then if you look on to chapter 33, you will see, let's say, verse 5. From verse 5 onwards, you see the Lord exalted, for he dwells on high. He will fill Zion with justice and righteousness. The Lord will be the sure foundation of our times, a rich store of salvation and wisdom and knowledge. And the fear of the Lord is the key to his treasure. Many of us are familiar with the Proverbs 3. Is it Proverbs 3? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So you see Isaiah often takes stuff out of Proverbs. It's not surprising because it's a book that he would have memorized probably as a child. We don't have time to look at much more of 33. Perhaps you could look at verse 13, where there's a wonderful promise. It reminds me of the promise given to Job. But here it says, your eyes will see the king in his beauty and view a land that stretches afar. I think hidden in there is this idea of a physical resurrection of the body. And we'll see that in more, I think, in 34 and 35. But we will see with our own eyes. It's like it says to Job in Job 19. You'll see with your own flesh. He trusts that he will see with his own flesh the Messiah. And then a beautiful bit of scripture that is used in the liturgy at Yom Kippur in synagogue. For the Lord, in verse 33, verse 22, for the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. It is he who will save us. He's the only way we can be saved, because only our judge, only because he's the judge and because he's the lawgiver and because he's the king, he can save us. And because of that, Messiah is our only real hope. Okay, and so now we get to 34, 35, and 36. I want to first give you some sort of a little summary of each chapter, so that you can see why, see Isaiah's purpose in describing what my Bible calls the joy of the redeemed in chapter 35. I want to suggest that Isaiah in chapter 34 is making judgment a reality. So the reality of judgment is what 34 is about. The rejoicing of the redeemed is what 35 is about. And 36 is about the rock of history. And I'll start at the bottom with 36. Why do I say that this chapter is best summarized as the rock of history? Well, take a look at the beginning of 36. It's incredibly detailed. It's not just in the 14th year of a king. It's a named king. It describes fortified cities and battles and captures and individuals, secretaries being sent backwards and forwards with the kind of detail that we had to endure today. If you had to watch the opening of the Houses of Parliament, there's so much detail in every single aspect of that ceremony. And we've got the same kind of detail in chapter 36. And what's happening in chapter 36 is that the faith of the faithful is being challenged. The faith of the faithful is being challenged. It's, Hezekiah, he gets challenged, and and so do Israel get challenged, because the king of Assyria thinks he's super, and he says, "What? How is your God different from any other god? I've annihilated the God of all these other nations." He manages to speak Hebrew, and Aramaic. He claims to be sent by God, and so he really undermines the believers. But Hezekiah goes to Isaiah and is told that the city will not be overrun, and overnight the angel of the Lord comes and destroys, I think it's like 135,000 people, and where's it gone? It's 37 verse 36. The angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp, and unsurprisingly, they all ran away. So it's interesting, because you can say that 36 and 37 is a story of God's people under threat, calling out to God for rescue and being delivered. But it's all done in a very tight sort of historic sort of way, in the same way that Christianity is, as I often say, Christianity is this historic faith that we can trust, because it is the story of God entering into time to be with us. And so what we expect to see is lots of historic stuff. Well, moving. So the first thing you need to see is there's the bottom of this story, 36, is the rock of history. And then the top of the story is this all-encompassing, cosmic, cataclysmic, certainty of judgment. And I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll read you the first verse. "Come near, you nations, and listen. Pay attention, you peoples. Let the earth hear, and all that is in it, the world and all that comes out of it." Can you see the kind of the all-encompassing cosmic scale of the judgment? The reason this God is greater than the gods that the king of Assyria had defeated before is because this is the God of creation. And what is surprising is who the God of creation has chosen as his people. And that sometimes undermines our confidence, because we forget that it's him. It's his battle and not our own. Anyway, pay attention, all you people. The Lord is angry with all the nations. His wrath is upon their armies. He will totally destroy them. He'll give them over to slaughter. Their slain will be thrown out. Their dead bodies will send up a stench. The mountains will be soaked with blood. All the stars and heavens will be dissolved, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll. If you want to see how great Isaiah thinks his God is, think about how great a God has to be able to roll the sky up like a scroll. All the starry hosts will fall. And then he goes into, from this great cosmic unimaginable thing, he then goes to withered leaves and shriveled figs. So the judgment is going to be like the little flower that fell off my orchid this morning and tumbled down, from that tiny little detail right up to the stars in the sky. That's the scale. And if you read through 34, it's sort of it's a bit like a crime scene, the way it's being described. If you like those crime stories, I'm watching one about a real life crime, a fictionalized story of a real life crime. I've stopped watching it. It's just horrid. I started. I feel a little bit like that when I look at Isaiah 34. The sword of the Lord is bathed in blood in verse 6. And then in verse 8, it says, for the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of retribution to uphold Zion's cause. And that really caught my attention. It caught my attention because the question was, what is the purpose of the day of vengeance? What is the outcome of the year of retribution? It is to uphold Zion's cause. It's to uphold Zion's cause. The divine holiness and human sin necessitates a day of vengeance and a year of retribution in order for Zion to happen. That's what we're seeing there. And then what you see is Edom's streams turning into pitch. Edom is like a way of talking about God's enemies in a sort of general term. So Edom, Esau, Edomites, enemies of God, as compared to Jacob. And then if you look down, you'll see more of this desolation. And then something really amazing, which I've never seen before. In verse 11, it says, God will stretch over Edom, over his enemies, the measuring line of chaos and the plumb line of desolation. And I thought, good, I can tell them that the measuring line is sort of horizontal. And the plumb line, if you know what that is, it's a piece of string with a weight on the bottom, and that's vertical. So if you've got vertical and horizontal, you've got everything. And then I discovered that chaos and desolation are in the Hebrew tohu and bohu. And some of you may know that pairing is the beginning in Genesis 1, that the earth was formless and empty. So Isaiah in the Hebrew is signposting that this is on the same scale as creation in Genesis 1. And then there is the sort of the outworking of God's judgment, leaves desert creatures. There seem to be a lot of owls. For some reason, it's very difficult to identify what kind of bird it is. I saw an ornithologist with his binoculars and I went for a walk today, but he wouldn't be able to tell us what these animals were. But I think what we can safely say is that owls hunt and kill, and they'll also eat dead stuff. And dead stuff and killing, they're unclean. So there's a sense that of uncleanness and of death in this section. And then in verse 16, it says, look in the scroll of the Lord and read. None of these will be missing. Not one of them will lack her mate. For it is his mouth that has given the order, and his spirit that will gather them together. He allots their portions. His hand distributes them by his measure. They will possess it forever and dwell there from generation to generation. Well, the commentators have a field day, as they always do, when they don't know the answer to something. Not only do we not know the identity of the owls, we also don't know what this scroll of the Lord is. So it could be Torah, it could be a particular scroll, it could be anything, but we can't be sure. And it doesn't. But what we can be sure is what we're supposed to see in the scroll. It is his mouth that has given the order, and his spirit will gather them together. He will allot their portion and distribute them by measure. By his mouth, he gives the order. You'll again remember, by his mouth, creation came into being. So there's this promise. The promises that we're hearing God make through Isaiah come from God's mouth. Although they are spoken by the prophet, they come from God's mouth. And it is his spirit that will gather them together. God acts in power through his spirit in creation, whether it's to gather the people together or even to gather the animals into the ark before the flood. He allots their portions. His hand distributes them by measure. Now we have the hand of God, which is his personal action. It's his personal action. He allots their portions. His hand distributes them by measure. Excuse me. When we get to the end of Isaiah chapter 53, the servant, he will be given the many as his portion. He will distribute them. He will distribute the loot of that is the reward for his faithfulness. And finally, we get to Isaiah 35, which I am going to read. But again, I just want to remind you, the first thing is judgment's universal. Then I'm going to look at the joy that we can have as knowing that we are his redeemed people. And we can also know, that he will act when we are under threat and lead us to a great deliverance. That's what you can see in 36. 35, verse 1. The desert and the parched land will be glad of them. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it will burst into bloom. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord and the splendor of our God. That's the first kind of chunk that we'll look at. The desert and the parched land will be glad of them. If you're struggling to see the of them, because like me, you're using the NIV, that's because the NIV decided not to put the of them in for some reason. Often they do that when they just to make the English flow better. That's one of the downsides of a dynamic translation. But the first line is the picture of a desert and a parched land being glad of the them. But we don't yet know who the them are. Maybe that's another reason why the NIV didn't put it. And then look, he says, the wilderness will rejoice and blossom. The rabbis say that in Exodus 20, when God gave the Ten Commandments from the top of Mount Sinai, that the desert blossomed. It burst forth with crocuses and flowers, and so you'll see flowers play a big part in various different celebrations throughout the year, particularly in the high holidays. But not, I'll tell you, don't bring. If you go to a religious Jewish funeral, cut flowers isn't the thing. Strangely, you bring a stone. That'll be the thing to bring. So, the desert and the parched land will be glad. The wilderness will rejoice and blossom like a crocus. It will burst into bloom. It reminded me of Romans 8:22, that all creation has been held and it yearns to be released, and to be released into this wonderful, glorious, exciting new creation. See the words that he uses. He chooses the crocus, a very delicate flower, isn't it? It's a very delicate flower, but it's bursting into bloom, and there's just this sense of great rejoicing. It will rejoice greatly and shout for joy. Creation is going to rejoice and shout greatly when something arrives, but we don't know what the them or the something is yet. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the splendor of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the splendor of our God. Now we know it's the they. These theys will see the glory of the Lord and the splendour of our God. Whoever the theys are, they are not almost, they almost don't notice creation because they're taken up with the splendour and the glory of God, and the Lord there is Yod He Vav He, the tetragrammaton. They're so captivated by the sight of God in his fullness that they don't even notice the crocuses. But the crocuses notice what's happened because they've been released from this bondage that they've been in through no fault of their own that's described in Romans. So that's that's the first little piece. And really what Isaiah is showing us is that this day of the Lord that brings vengeance and retribution is necessary for Zion's cause. And now we've seen Zion's cause described. So the next little section, Isaiah gets very much more like Paul. He gets very much more like Paul in one of his epistles. Look what he says. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Behold your God. He will come with vengeance, and with divine retribution, he'll come to save you. The message of that first verse, strengthen feeble hands, steady the knees that give way, say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. It's not a message of a new blessing, but a reminder of what the people already have. You see that? It's not something new. Strengthen the feeble hands, steady the knees that give way, say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. You'll remember, I'm sure, that in Joshua 1, God gives Joshua the instruction, be strong, do not fear. He doesn't give it, he gives it to him in the land. And repeatedly, God is saying to us, be strong, do not fear. If you're one of the theys, then your destination is certain. And this section will climax describing that very destination. So feeble hands, knees, and fearful hearts. Hands are our actions. So people that he's encouraging us to be active in our faith. Steady knees that give way. I took some medication in January that I'd never had before. I went out to get a cup of tea from the kitchen, and both my legs suddenly just gave way. It was bizarre. I just completely, and so I was completely helpless, which is a good picture of really what we are spiritually without him. So hands are actions, knees are stability, and fearful hearts, I don't need to tell you. It's hard to see sometimes God's hand in this crazy world. And that's why he says to us, be strong and do not fear. And then again, the NIV does us a disservice. Mine says, your God will come. But actually it says, behold your God. And to behold your God, I'm sorry to do this to you, but we used to sing a song, behold your God, seated on the throne, come let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Da, 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 da. Anyway, you can look it up on YouTube and you'll hear the tune is probably very different from that, but that's the best I can do. But that's the first thing. The first thing he wants to do is say to us, behold your God. Beholding God is the answer for fearful hearts, weak knees, and dodgy hands. Unclean hands, I should say, not dodgy. And look again, he will come with vengeance. He will come to save you. It's a he that will come. So and remember that this is the scripture when John the Baptist asked Jesus if there was anyone to come, was it him or should we be expecting somebody else? This is the text that Jesus used to convince John that he was the Messiah, So he will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He'll come and save you, which is great news, especially when you look at the power and the destruction that he's able to wreak in chapter 34. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb shout for joy. This is what Jesus is alluding to when he says the blind will receive sight, the lame will walk, the deaf will hear. And he also talks about sort of good news being proclaimed to the poor, which is more Isaiah 61. But he takes these, he sort of makes a sort of summary of what's been going on. And Matthew, in the run up to chapter 11, in from about chapter 4 onwards, I think, has given us lots of examples of Jesus doing exactly the things that are described here in Isaiah 35. And the idea here is that when the Messiah comes, he will do examples of what will be done in the end. So all his healing ministry is a picture of the final healing that comes at the end of time. So it's his eschatological identity that is being described by his healings. And that's why I think Jesus uses this as a way of saying to John, there's no one else to come. This is it. This is where we are on the timeline. You've seen the deaf hear, the lame leap. You remember that, although the best leaping example I can think of is the one in Acts. Do you remember the man is leaping and dancing is beautiful. He sat at the gate and he get silver and gold I do not have, but in the name of the Lord Jesus, stand up away. And he's like leaping and jumping around, which must have been very bad for business, but he wasn't thinking in commercial terms at that point. He was just so glad to be free. And that it's I think Jesus says for free. Oh no, Paul says he sets us free. For freedom he has set us free. So leaping like a deer, and then water will gush in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, thirsty ground, bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow. Where has water gushed forth in the wilderness before? In the story of Exodus with the rock, with Moses, we've seen exactly that. So we're seeing something greater than what happened in the wilderness. Not only is the desert and parched land glad and transformed, but now there's something greater. Burning sand will become a pool. It's lovely, just transformational pictures of when I went to Israel. We went to the Dead Sea, and they said, you'll need your shoes because the sand's really hot. Yeah, I got tough feet. I'll be fine. Was the sound I made as I ran back into the changing room to get my shoes. So, but then when you hit the water, it's delightful. So that's the idea. If you think of, maybe it isn't so helpful to think of Simon burning his feet on the sand, but some of you might have done the same thing. And then you get to the water and it's like, And that's what's being pictured here for us to see. Thirsty ground, bubbling springs. So instead of being thirsty, streams of living water are bubbling out of the ground. You see that? These sort of pairs or parallels, very common throughout this poem which we're reading. Okay, and then instead of jackals, grass and reeds and papyrus grow. So it's just where once there was a desert, now there's life and greenery and life and greenery. Now, and a highway will be there. So this will have all the green people making petitions about the green belt being taken up. What are you doing? Putting a highway, a motorway. You're putting a big highway. A highway will be there, and it will be called the way of holiness. The unclean will not journey on it. It will be for those who walk that way. Wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, nor will any ferocious beast get up on it. They will not be found there. So we're seeing a highway. You'll see that Isaiah has this highway appear in chapter 11, verse 16, in chapter 19, 23, in chapter 33, verse 8, chapter 40, verse 3, chapter 49, verse 11, and chapter 62, verse 10. And very often the imagery that's it's the imagery that links this idea of the highway is the idea of Egypt, Assyria, and Israel all traveling along this highway together to go and worship God. So if you want, when we get to the discussion part, I can show you some of that if people are interested. And then look, who gets to go on this? Who gets to go on this road? Well, first he says who's not there. There's no unclean people there. That means none of us could go without the gospel to cleanse us. There's no wicked fools on it, no lions, no ferocious, no danger from creation. And then it says, but only the redeemed will walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord will return. I said to Ruth that she was in this Bible study, and I want to be faithful to that promise. The redeemed and the ransomed. So the ransomed is the Exodus idea. The redeemed, actually, the best example of the redeemed idea here is the kinsman redeemer of Boaz in Ruth. In Ruth 3 and 4, you have the story of the redemption, and Boaz is not the nearest person in the family to redeem Ruth, and so he goes to the guy who is and says, you should redeem the land. And the man says, yes, I'll redeem the land. And then he says, but you'll have to take the lady as well. And then he says, oh no, I can't do that, it'll mess everything up. I put my estate in order, I can't do that. And so that's how it's Boaz. And then Boaz is delighted to have been allowed to redeem Ruth, and because he sort of says to her, you could have had anybody, but you chose me. This Gaol, the avenger, as it's used in, it's sort of, there's a sense here of kinsman avenger. It's the sense that God wants to be close to these people that he's redeemed, as if it's a sense of nearness, the same nearness that was in the marriage of Boaz. And then, so we are walking along this great road together, and where are we heading? We're heading for Zion with singing, where everlasting joy will be our crown. Gladness and joy will overtake us, and sorrow and sighing will flee. It sort of, I don't know really what to say beyond what the text says, because the text tells us that we're going to head into this new creation Zion with singing, and not temporary joy, not the joy of receiving a beautiful birthday card or the return of a teenager from university, if that's a joyful experience for some of you. I think it's more for me the Exodus, but nonetheless. It's an everlasting joy. And because this is poetry, this everlasting joy can be a crown on our heads. At the opening of the Houses of Parliament today, you saw the crown, the Queen's crown, being brought in, and it sparkled. You just never seen anything like that. Well, I suppose that's the whole point. It sparkles beautifully. It's encrusted with pearls and emeralds and sapphires and diamonds. It's incredible. We will wear everlasting joy like a crown. And then the last bit I just love: gladness and joy will overtake them. The sense of it is like gladness and joy is just raced ahead of us to get there. So, and then sorrow and sighing will flee. So it's this parallelism. You've got the forward to joy. Joy and gladness are running one way, and sorrow and sighing are running the other. And so where we are left is in Zion with nothing but joy and eternal gladness. Which brings us back to why I was thinking of Philippians in the first place, because Philippians is constantly telling us to rejoice and be glad. So this evening, I think what you can see is a call for us to follow the advice of Isaiah 35 verse 4. Be strong and do not fear. Behold your God. He will come, and he will come to save us. And he will lead us on this wonderful road through the gates of Zion, where we will celebrate with crowns of gladness, and joy will overtake us, and sorrow and sighing will flee. And that is a great hope for us. It is exactly the hope that Paul is trying to instruct the Philippians to see, so that they can live like stars shining in the sky in a crooked and depraved generation. All right.